Hello, everyone. Peter Carson here, top of the hour, top of the day to you, and welcome to our guest expert webinar with John White, 6 ways to get insights on your Microsoft 365 usage. I'm not going to take a lot of time here. I'm just acting as MC, but quick intro and background, Extranet User Manager. I'm the president, Peter Carson, also Office Apps and Services MVP. And that's really all I wanted to say here. I want to make sure John's got the floor and able to take us through the presentation for the next hour. We'll do a little wrap up at the end. John, I'm just going to make you presenter and you have the floor.
Excellent stuff. I'm going to go ahead and show my screen. Let's see if I can pick the right screen. That's always a good idea. Let's see. And I'm going to go ahead. All right. So are we seeing a slide?
We are. That looks good, John.
Excellent stuff. All right. I'll kick in. So hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. We're going to be talking a little bit today about gaining insight, and the 6 ways, as I've titled it, to gain insight on your Microsoft 365 usage. I'm going to slip a few times today and call it Office 365, I'm sure, but the rebrand is Microsoft 365, and that's what we're talking about today. All right, so I will advance my slide. There we go. So by means of introduction, as you heard, my name's John White. I'm a CTO and co-founder of a company called UnlimitedViz. We make a product called tyGraph, and the two get conflated anymore, so we tend to refer to ourselves as tyGraph. tyGraph is an analytical product for Microsoft 365. So there will be a number of references to the product in here. This is by no means meant to be a product pitch, but there are some aspects here that dovetail on what we do, and obviously that's where my experience lies. So I'll be referencing it a few times. I'm a Office Apps and Services MVP, and that means basically a SharePoint MVP. Have been for quite some time now, and more recently I've also been awarded a Data Platform MVP, which basically means Power BI. Those are my contact details there on the screen, so please feel free to reach out and contact me if you have any questions afterwards. If you want more information about anything I'm talking here, I'd be happy to help. I would also urge you to ask some questions during this presentation. I believe Amanda and Christian will be watching the chat channel, and if you've got any questions, I'd love to answer them as we go along. I don't like to leave anybody stranded as we go by. And then finally, yeah, that's me in the picture doing what I like to do when I'm not doing this sort of thing, well, or I'm not cooped up in the house for months on end. But it also explains my rather odd Twitter handle. So you know what I like to do, and you know how old I am. So with that, let's move along. Oh, one other means of intro. If you're interested in business intelligence and Power BI in particular, you may be interested in a podcast I host weekly with my buddy Jason Himmelstein. It's called Bifocal, and we basically cover the news of the day, have interviews from time to time with Power BI product team, et cetera, and talk about just what's going on in the BI community. Okay, so from an agenda standpoint today, I want to talk a little bit about reporting and analytics and what the differences are between the two. Before we launch into the meat of it, we'll cover off a little bit of the what and the why before we cover off the bulk of the how, which is the rest of it. To start out with, we'll look at how we can gain insights with a lot of the out-of-the-box stuff. First of all, the Microsoft administration portal. Then we're going to have a look at the Microsoft 365 Usage Analytics app, or it used to be referred to as a content pack. We'll look at what is available from an API standpoint for reporting, then dive into the nitty-gritties with the unified audit log. And then we're going to pivot just a little bit and look at, instead of activities, we're going to look at inventory. I'll make a distinction between those two when we get there. And we're going to have a look at getting data from Microsoft Graph and Graph Data Connect. And then finally, I'll just mention a few third-party products. Again, as I referenced earlier, tyGraph is one of those things. And before we wrap up for the day, hopefully that's a solid agenda. So let's dive into it. So to start out with, let's talk about reporting and analytics. So why do we want to do this? Why do we care? Why do we want to look at the usage data for Microsoft 365. And there are a number of reasons. And what's important is to know your reason, is to understand what it is you're after, because that's going to inform the way you go about it and what you're going to need from a design standpoint. So to start with, one of the reasons you might want to analyze this stuff is for DLP, data loss prevention, and governance reasons. Essentially policing your network. You might want to know who's accessing a document, or if people are accessing the document that shouldn't. Is data leaving the organization, or is it being shared with people it shouldn't be? Things of that nature. So we can forensically go back potentially and look at what's happened. We may want to measure the effectiveness of our communication. That's going to be if you're working with, say, a communications department. They may want to know, did this campaign have the desired effect? Does this document have an audience? Things of that nature. So analytics can help us with that. Adoption is a big topic. As we digitally transform, we want to make sure all of our people are coming along for the ride. They're best using the tools we've provided to them. So adoption measurement is an important factor. License management. We're paying for, especially for a large organization, they spend quite a bit of money on their licenses. They want to make sure they're being used effectively. Maybe they need more licenses, maybe they need fewer licenses. So analytics is a way to determine that. And just troubleshooting. What happened in my organization? Why did this happen? This was here and then it disappeared. What's going on? So analytics, again, can help us with these sorts of questions. So given the why, you have to know what it is you're going to monitor. And you'll be able to, you'll need to go out and get information about all of these dimensions. Things like users, right? If we're looking at who's using what, or if we're looking at adoption, if we're looking at license management, things of that nature, we're going to need to know who. And as a warning, you got to worry a bit about privacy concerns when you're dealing with people. What are the privacy concerns in your organization? What are the rules? What do you have to follow? So you should be aware of all of that sort of thing. We need to be able to monitor all the various workloads. Where is my content? I use Teams, for example, or we use Teams. So do we just need to be able to monitor Teams? Well, maybe not, because if my Teams environment, well, first of all, my Teams environment is backed by SharePoint. So if I need to get information about documents from Teams, I'm actually going and getting information about documents from SharePoint. So we need to be aware of our workloads. We may also have tabs in our Teams environment to Power BI, to Planner, things of that nature. So we need to be aware of our workloads themselves. And then the content itself, we want to be able to get down to the content level. I've got a document out there. Are people reading it? Are people consuming it? Things of that nature. An important criteria dimensionally here is time. It's one thing to know where we're at today, where we were at last month or last year, but how are we trending over time, and what level of granularity of time do we need to be concerned with? Do we need to think about day over day, hour over hour, minute after minute? Going back to the previous slide of what we should be concerned about, that will help inform that. If we're looking at adoption month over month, then that's the only granularity of time we're going to need. But if we're dealing with things forensically, I need to establish a chain of events that led to, say, a document's deletion or creation or editing. I'm going to need to get every atomic transaction there down to the second as to when things happen. And then I'm also going to want to know what devices people are using to access this content and these workloads, et cetera, so I can properly optimize my experience. Maybe everyone's just using mobile. Maybe the predominant audience is using PCs, etc., tablets, whatever. We're going to need to know what people are using so we can design experiences to best suit them. And here's where I like to make a distinction between reporting and analytics. And the two terms, the reason I wish to do so is that the two terms get conflated far too often, I think. We hear about analytics products when they're actually just a set of reports. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we need to understand, what either is able to do. And the fundamental, by the way, the graphic here is, if anybody on the call is familiar with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, this is one of the artist renderings of the ultimate computer, the answer to everything, called Deep Thought, or that would be able to find the answer to everything. Deep Thought was built to answer the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And people waited for a very, very long time, eons, and it finally came back with an answer. The answer was 42. The people said, 42, well, what's that mean? They said, I think the computer answered back, I don't think you really established the question that well. And that's really what, if that resonates, hopefully. But essentially, reports make sense when you've asked the question clearly ahead of time. But if you don't know what answers the results you're seeing, you may want to drill down in your data a little bit further. The link at the bottom here is a blog post I wrote, talking about this. But so reports are answering questions that you have. So when you run a sales report on a monthly basis, I want to know what the numbers this month are, this week are, et cetera. This is something we do repetitively, something we know we're always going to have the same questions. But when something crops up that makes us wonder why, we need to delve into the world of analytics. So we need to be able to drill down into these data points and figure out what's going on. And there are different tools for doing different things. And it's important to remember that, especially again, when we're gaining insights from Microsoft 365. The different tools have different strengths. Some are strong from a reporting standpoint. Some are strong from an analytical standpoint. What you'll find generally is the tools that aim at reporting are simpler. They're easy to use. As with everything, with increased flexibility comes increased complexity, and that's certainly true in this realm. I'm just glancing over. So far, we don't seem to have too many questions, so I'm just going to rip in. Although I haven't gotten very specific yet, have I? So there you go. So to start with, if you want to get some top of the waves information about how you're using Microsoft 365, you should probably start with the administration portal if you have access. The administration portal requires the reporter role, the reports role, but if you have that, you can go in here and see this sort of top of the waves analysis. And here's a screenshot of the principal dashboard that you'll see when you come into the admin center under the reports section and choose the usage node. You're going to see a chart of activity. What that activity is depends. Well, no, sorry, it's an overall set of activity on the dashboard, broken down by the various workloads. And if you look at the top, there's a slicer that lets you break things down by 7-day, 30-day, 90-day, and 180-day increments. And then you have a series of charts. There's more than just fit on this particular screen down below, but you can see what that activity looks like for, say, email. You have a number of emails. With OneDrive, you have total storage. With SharePoint, you have the number of files. So this is, again, a top of the waves analysis. If you select a different period, here we have 30 days selected, but if you pick 7 days, then those charts down at the bottom will update accordingly. The activity chart at the top will show you on a day-by-day basis what that score is. And in this case, it's a total number of activities. You can drill down a little bit deeper on a workload level. If I wanted to see more about email, I can drill into the email page, and it gives us something very similar. We've got here 7 days selected, and so you can see over the past 7 days the various messages now that were sent, received, and read. That's per day. And then you can see down below there's a breakout detail table showing you the name of the user, what the last activity date was, and when those actions were. And if I had picked, how many actions there were for send, receive, and read. And if I had picked 30 days or 90 days, we're going to get a total over that period. So the highest level of granularity we have here is 7 days. SharePoint, there's something very similar. We can look at files. We can also view pages or the number of users by day. Here we're looking at a 30-day window, and again, similar table below with the details, again by user, by day, and then the number of number of files viewed or edited, synced, and these are all of the various measures that are available through the admin interface. Same sort of thing for OneDrive. It's almost identical to SharePoint. And then with Teams, we're dealing with messages. And it's important to note when you're dealing with Teams data, you're talking about messages, because everything else in Teams is coming from somewhere else, most predominantly from SharePoint. And there are a number of other workloads tracked. I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but just as an overall Office 365 concept, we look at the number of activations of users, how many users are active, how many are performing functions, activity through groups, basically teams, or the concept of groups as it debuted in 2015. Multi-geo distribution reports, and then you also have some information around Yammer and Skype for Business. Actually, Skype for Business has an awful lot of reports in here because this was kind of the first data that was tracked through this mechanism. I already kind of called out the time intelligence situation, so we can look at this data in 7, 30, 90, and 180 day increments. And over 180 days, that data is gone. You will not be able to go back and see that in any way. And then when we're looking at those charts, those little charts at the top of the screens, they're always in a level of day. So we can see the total of whatever that measure is by day. But there's really no flexibility here in terms of being able to go and look at multiple measures at the same time, or to be able to slice and dice on multiple dimensions. You're getting what you're getting. The data in behind the scenes is pre-aggregated. You can see that
John,
here. Oh, yeah, sure.
Sorry, just to interject, there's a question around reports and
Yes.
the roles required.
Mm-hmm.
Having an issue understanding roles, and is the reports role required, or will the reader role work?
The reports role is required to see this, 100%.
Great.
It's also required for the next section that we're getting to, which is the usage analytics application.
Thank you.
All right, anything else before we go?
No, that's it.
I'll take that as a no. All right, great. Any of these reports can be exported, and it's not exactly what you see. It's mostly what you see is what you get, although you don't get users in your reports. That's one of the interesting factors. It may be a GDPR requirement. I'm not 100% sure. But when you export a report, you're going to basically download a CSV of what you're looking at. And the screenshot here is giving you an example of that. First column showing you the day it was refreshed, and that's refreshed in the back end. So when was the data updated behind the scenes? Because there is some data latency going on. And in this case, how many pages were visited, how many pages were viewed or edited. This is a SharePoint activity, user activity report. And then it's giving you on the report date. And this metric is a cumulative sum over 90 days. You can see that on the report period on the right-hand side. I mentioned that there's no user data exported. And again, the export doesn't give you any more granularity. It's a pre-aggregated report according to those time frames that were already available. All right, section 1 done. Let's look at the Microsoft 365 Usage Analytics app. So that portal may not, there might be a number of reasons that portal, if it does the job for you, by the way, great. But it may not be flexible enough for you. You may want to delve in a little more and have a look yourself. And the next step most people head toward is the Usage Analytics app. Now this is, it used to be called I can never remember the full name of it, but it was referred to as a content pack. It's a Power BI. It was a content pack. Now it's a Power BI app. And what it's doing, it's essentially powered by the same data that's behind those reports in the admin interface. It's slightly different. But the fact that it's deployed through Power BI means a number of things. To start with, it's a Power BI app, so to be able to either create it or use it to read data from it, you're going to need a pro license, Power BI Pro license, or you're going to have Power BI Premium capacity. All right, so you can't use it with a free Power BI account like you could the old content pack. That's one thing. The one nice thing here, however, is that I mentioned the reporting role before that was necessary to see it. Only the user creating this or the data set owner has to have the reporting role, because what you're doing is on a periodic basis, you're refreshing the data in the report, and then you're sharing that report out amongst a potentially wider audience through the app. So it's only the owner that needs to have that reporting role. And as a consequence, of course, you can grant access to any non-admin user or users that don't have that reporting role. They just won't be able to manage it or set up refreshes. Within the app, you can refresh up to 8 times a day in Pro, 48 times a day in Premium, but it's important to note that the data you're pulling from is updated daily. So that source data where this app is getting its data from is only being updated daily. So there's no point in updating your reports anymore than daily. And although it's called the Usage Analytics app, I look at this, and you will see why here. It's more reporting than analytics. There are a lot of dimensions and measures you can play with, but they're all kind of tightly bound to each other. That makes slicing and dicing across them somewhat difficult. Let's have a look at why that is. All right, I'm just going to pull up one thing here, and I'm just going to exit the presentation for just a second. I'm going to try to anyway. There we go. All right, so what you're seeing on the screen here, hopefully I should stop and ask, is everybody seeing a Power BI apps or Power BI interface?
Yep, yep, we can see it.
Cool. Perfect. So what I'm in my Power BI environment, and I'm in the apps section, and you can see I've already deployed out this thing called the Microsoft 365 Usage Analytics app. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that. And I'm taken to a fairly attractive dashboard here right off the bat that's showing me kind of the same information we saw in the admin portal. There's some different measures. It's presented differently, but that's kind of the idea. You can see, for example, under usage, we can see for each workload what the percentage of active users were, and that's the number of users who are actively using the product versus the number of users that are active in my network or in my tenant. And then we can see some specific measures across all of the workloads: Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, etc. Now, one thing you'll note about that is the title of each one of these: March 2020 active user, March 2020 storage use, etc. Well, it's April 29th. Why am I not seeing any data for April? Because the executive summary is only giving me data for the previous month. If I want to go any deeper, I'm going to need to jump into the overview. And now we can see some month-over-month comparisons. We see April. We see some data for April, March, et cetera, and we can see the number of enabled users, active users, month-over-month returning users, etc. This is very much adoption metrics that we care about. We also are still seeing our March 2020 summary information. That hasn't changed. And at the top, we can slice on workloads. So for example, for Exchange, we can see how these numbers related just for the Exchange workload, or for SharePoint, it's just for the SharePoint workload. Alternatively, we could open up this month. Let's look at November 2019, and we can see what those totals were for each of the workload that way. And you'll see the effect of clicking one of these workloads is really, it's just a filter on the page. It's a slicer, all right? So that gives, that's starting to give us some month-over-month stuff. Let's come down here to the activation and the licensing section. It's also very similar. In this case, it's showing us how many users were activated versus active, and that starts to inform some of our licensing decisions. Maybe some of these people don't need to have active licenses or don't need to be assigned licenses if they're not using it. And you can start to slice and dice that stuff by workload as well. I'm going to pop down to product usage. Similar idea, but now we're getting into measures that are more specific to some of these workloads. So this doesn't give us an overview. This is giving us information for Exchange. So you can see things like email read, the total number, how many active users there were, email received, et cetera, et cetera. So some of these pre-chosen metrics, or let's come over here to say OneDrive, we're getting the number of sites, we're getting the number of users, which is going to be almost always exactly the same thing because each user gets one site. SharePoint might be a little more interesting that way. So again, number of active sites versus the number of sites existing in the system. So the metrics are going to depend on the product in that particular case. And then finally, we've got user activity down here. And so we can see who's essentially doing what, again, sliced by product along the top here. Now, this is giving us a fair bit of stuff, but again, this is just a report. I want to do some analysis. One way I can do this is I can just flip over here. I'm going to edit this app now, and I'm going to be taken into the workspace that's underneath this app in Power BI. That's how it works. And I'm just going to open that report up again, but this time I'm going to go into edit mode. All right, now that I'm in edit mode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to edit or create a new page. I'm just going to create a completely blank new page. And then I'm going to come down to the user activity section. This is a table. And I can see there's a whole pile of information down here about users. And if I can just pull this guy over to the left, it's a little easier to read and it's almost impossible to do. There we go. So I'm going to pull this over here. So under Exchange, I'm just going to look at mails read. All right, I'm going to select mails read. And that's a total number of mails read for our organization. Now, I might want to break that out a couple of different ways. If I come down here to users, it happens to be in the user state table. This is the way they've built it. I could come down here and find somewhere in here. Where am I going to find that? The display name of the user. And there you can see Ed has read most of the email in the organization. I'm number 2. This is our real data, by the way, that I'm showing you. So hopefully I'm not giving away any secrets. But that's one way to go about doing this. But what if I wanted to see this over time? And to make it easy, I could combine the two, name and time, but I want to come up here to calendar. And I'm just going to pick date, and I'm going to add this to my chart axis right here. All right, so you can see here for 2020, we've got 12,000 users. I'm going to drill down on this. And in Q1, that's the same number. And in March, it's the same. What's going on here? I know I've got data from 2019 through 2020. The problem is, the reason we're not seeing this data over time is that the data around users, in this particular case, the data in this table is tied to a specific date, and that's that March date. That we saw these in the summaries. So all the measures that are contained here are for a specific point in time. That's not to say that that's the only way that works. I'm going to pick a different measure now. I'm going to deselect EXO mail read and this guy, and I'm going to come up to tenant mailbox usage, the table of tenant mailbox usage, which is right here. So I'm going to look at what's going on within the tenant mailbox, and I'm going to pick, for example, Exchange Online storage. Well, let's have a look at storage used over time. It doesn't really matter which one. So we've got measures in here as well that pertain specifically to the Exchange workload. And I could pick this date, this content date. Come on, John, select it. You can do it. There we go. And you can see this breaks down. We've got data for 2019. I'm going to lose the quarter, but I am going to drill down on it and see that we can see what our storage looked like down to the month level. And let's go down to the next level, the day level, and it doesn't really look any different. So all of the data in here in this content pack only rolls up to the month, all right? Even when you can, otherwise it's a single point in time. And another problem with having say the content date in this particular table is that these dates only pertain to the measures that are contained with this table. I don't have a way here to slice across time for all of the workloads. So we have to be aware of that. That's just the way that this particular feature is built. All right. And do we have any questions on this before I move on to the next level, next stage? It's quiet. All right.
Nothing there. Thanks, John.
Okay, no problem, no problem. All right, so we're through 2. We're halfway in, so I better keep going. The next up are the reporting APIs. So the portal didn't necessarily do it for us. The management app maybe doesn't do it for us. Let's dig into the data, the real meaty data underneath this stuff. So again, this is a similar, the data that you can get here is similar to the data we got from previous levels, but you have more control over what's going on. You're going to have the same measures, but you can get things down to day level granularity, etc. I'll explain it. But you have a number of endpoints. So this is, it's a Microsoft graph. It's technically a graph endpoint, but it has its own, it's its own thing. You can see a URL to it down at the bottom. You'll probably need to be a developer to play with this. But if you're a developer, it's one way to go and get this data for yourself. So again, a lot, just like the previous tools that we talked about, it's giving us, device usage, user activity for each one of these workloads, and it does so independently. What does it look like? When you call into it, you're going to download a CSV. That's basically what it's giving you, and it's giving you more detail than you could get, say, with the admin interface. For example, you're getting users in the output in this particular case, and you can call each endpoint a number of different ways. So down underneath each table is showing you an example of how that endpoint was called. In this case, we're calling in to get the team's user activity detail, and we're passing in a period D7. That means as of the most current date, and you can actually specify a date, but as of the most current date, give me the preceding 7-day totals. So you can see the report period is 7 days here. It's showing you for each person how many Teams chats they participated in, how many calls they had, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can take that data and do whatever you wish with it. That data is only maintained for 30 days. You should be aware of that. So if I called back and asked for 7 days prior and called back into a day more than a month ago, I'm not going to get any data back. And over on the right-hand side, you can see what you get when you specify a date, and that's giving us that day level of granularity. And with that day level of granularity, it's only giving us data for which there is an activity. So you can see the difference between these two. The one on the left-hand side is showing you for each user, regardless of whether or not they were active. So you wouldn't be able to, using the day levels, you wouldn't necessarily be able to get an indication of who is inactive. You'd only have data for who was active. You'd need to figure out a way to go about doing that. But if you were to do this, and you were to do this for each one of those endpoints, and you could do that daily, you could persist that data yourself and keep it as long as you wanted to. So the reporting APIs give you a similar similar measurements, but you have more control over it. But again, you have to do more work to get it. So I've talked a lot about granularity already. Don't really need to go into that a whole lot more. But I will call out latency. Now, latency, data latency is how old the data is. And when you're working with the reporting APIs, it will depend on your endpoint as to how old that data is. Remember, I was talking about the management, the management app previously, and how the source data is updated every day. Well, with the reporting endpoints, it's the same concept. That data is only made available once per day. And for some workloads, it's up to 1 day old. With other workloads, you may have to wait 2 days to get data. And with one, and that's Skype in particular, you have to wait 1 week. It all depends on what endpoint you're calling into, and you have to be aware of that. Okay. So we've gone through all of this stuff. We didn't want a dev, or we wanted more granularity, or we wanted to be able to slice and dice across multiple dimensions on the same measures. We need to dive into now, we're getting really down into the nitty-gritty, the unified audit log. And the unified audit log is pretty cool. It lets us dive into all of the data that we have, or sorry, all of the activity that anybody or anything has performed within our tenant through Microsoft 365. And it's accessible, at least, you know, at one level by mere mortals. So it's you can find it. There's a number of ways to get to it, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But the easiest way to understand it is through the Compliance Center. And the Compliance Center is again in through the management interface, but it has its own area. You can see the URL for it down at the bottom. And you can go in there and you can perform an audit log search. We'll do that here in just a second, so I won't dwell on this particular screen. But you can see that's basically how you get there. And then once you get there, you can see the granularity of the type of information that you get out of here. So for example here, I'm showing you all activities for a week, and it's giving you date and time, user, IP address, what the activity was. We'll have a demo of that here in just a second. So same thing as before, granularity and retention. It's infinitely granular. This is the atomic level. It doesn't get more granular than this. You do have to turn it on. It's not on by default for now. It is going to be over the next several months, I am told. But you do have to go and turn it on if it's not on already. And you get data from that point forward. It won't go back in time. It will keep all of that data for 90 days and not beyond that, except now, well, we'll get to that here in a second. So by default, it's 90 days. If you use the API to access this information, we'll talk about that here in a second as well, you can only go back and get it for 7 days. But it's available through the UI and it's available through PowerShell for 90 days. And now on a few specific workloads, SharePoint, Exchange, and Active Directory, you can set a policy that will allow you to keep that data for 1 year, but it's only on those workloads. And you can keep it for, I believe it's 6 months as well. That's another option, and that's brand new. You didn't used to be able to do that at all. Now the data is much more immediate. It's not updated just once per day. In fact, most of the time, it's better than what you see here on this chart. It does depend on the workload. So the service level agreement says, we'll show you your transactional data. It won't be any more than 30 minutes old for the items that are marked accordingly, or no more than 24 hours old for the other ones. This is just basically meant as a takeaway. No need to memorize it. By the way, I'll jump in here because I'm referencing it. There's a link at the bottom of each one of these slides, and that will give you the slide deck. It will also be made available after the presentation. Okay. I made reference to the access mechanisms earlier. So we saw a couple of screenshots from the Compliance Center, and that's the audit log search that you see here. It's also available via PowerShell. So if you're a PowerShell person, you could go and pull this data down that way, and you can start to get into some automation that way, although it can be a bit problematic. Or you could call in to the management API, and there's actually a series of management APIs. And once you do that, you could go and retrieve the data yourself and maintain it yourself. I will give you a word of warning. It's an awful lot of data. We make a business out of doing this, and it can be challenging from time to time. Let's just put it that way. But let's look at the easy way to work with this. Let's look at that Compliance Center, just so you can get a flavor of it. And this will be some real data. And hopefully everything's nice and fast today. So I'm going to pop over here now to my admin center. And that's that admin center I was talking about before. And I would normally come down here in the admin centers and pick the compliance section. The compliance section is actually going to take us over here to the Office 365 security and compliance area. And if I select down here under search, it's well hidden, by the way. Under search, it's not under reports. It's under search, and we go down to the audit log search, and that takes us to this URL here with that unified audit log. And this is giving us an interface. I'm going to just select it or refresh it so there's nothing here, so you can see it working. I've just left it with some results there. So you get a blank screen, And you could do just simply, if you want to know what's going on right now, I should be able to run a search. Just go hit search. It'll take just a second, and it should go back and show me all activity for a week, or basically put me in a position where I could scroll through all activity for a week. And it's a little slower today than it has been. So right here, you can see the latest activity it's reporting right now is almost an hour old, which when I did it yesterday was 5 minutes was the oldest. So it's variable. It depends on load of the back end, etc. So you can see that Ed signed into his mailbox. You can see that I accessed a file, and you can see it was a OneNote file that I was working with. Andre created a mailbox item in Exchange. So you can see all of these activities. It's a tremendous amount of information. If I wanted to narrow it down, let's come into the activities, and you can see all of the activities that are available. So here you see file and page activities from SharePoint folder, SharePoint list item activities. I'm scrolling fairly quickly. It's an awful lot of data. If I wanted to search on something in particular, I'm going to say view, and it's finding all of the activities with view in it. I might be interested in, say, SharePoint viewed pages, or come down here, I viewed a Power BI report. We do a fair bit of that stuff. And I'm just going to select back up here and run the search again. Give that a second. And 1 second here. And there you can see, perfect. Will had viewed a Power BI, or sorry, no, the TGPS2 had viewed a Power BI report. Here's an external user viewed a page, on a page we've shared out with partners, et cetera, et cetera. So you get the general idea of what's going on here. The user, what they did, and if you want to see some serious detail around that, let's have a look at, say, this Power BI report. This is me accessing a Power BI report. I'm going to click on more information, and that's all of the detail you get around this type of activity. Each type of activity has a different schema, so you get different information for each one, but there's some are in common, like the IP and the name of the user, et cetera. And there's some that are specific to the activity type, like in this case, the report name, the report ID, et cetera. And you can see this is that usage analytics report that I was messing with just before we got on the call. That's what that one's about. I could, at any point in time, I could export those results just by coming down here. I'll just go ahead and say download all of these results. So this will show me all of the view activities for that period of time. There you can see a CSV file downloading. It's a fair bit of data. Perhaps I should have restricted it. All right, and I'm going to open that guy up. And you can see, very simply, we get a column for date and time. We get a column for the user that performed that, what the operation was. So page viewed versus view report, and then a chunk of JSON data with all of that detail that we saw for each one of those activity types. All right. There are a few other things you can do here. You can create an alert whenever something happens. So give it a name here, but whenever, say, whenever these particular reports or activities are performed by particular users, I can have a report or have an email sent to someone. Not very great. You can't really set any thresholds around it when something's outside of a value, just when it happens. So limited value, but it's there. And I mentioned how you could set the retention policies previously. This is how you do it. You can set it per report type, and you can specify, we want this set for 90 days, which is the default, 6 months, or 1 year. And you can set, I think, 500 of them in the organization, et cetera. All right, that's the audit log. Let's pop back to the presentation. All right, so we're gonna change. Oh, I better hit present, shouldn't I? Let me just see the slide. All right, so we've been talking up until this point about activities, things that users have done. What we haven't talked about is inventory, what we have. So what do we have in our tenant? What are our document names? What are their properties, et cetera? And that information is available through the graph, not through any activity logs. The logs at best will give us a pointer back to what our content was, but if we want more information about our content, we're going to have to go into the graph to get that. There are a couple of ways of doing that. To start with, we'll have a demo of Graph Explorer. Graph Explorer basically lets us have a look at what's in the graph, the type of data, but the graph itself is meant to be a developer tool. So if you're going to work with the graph, for the most part, you're going to be building an application to do so. The Graph Explorer is part of the documentation that's online for Microsoft Graph that lets you experiment with it to see what's possible. Excuse me. So short of being a developer, there is another technology that's available called Microsoft Graph Data Connect, and it's still kind of limited at the moment in terms of what it can go get. The broad vision is that it will go and get all of the data that's available for the graph. As it stands right now, it can go get information about mail, things from Exchange, mailbox item. But it's done differently, as opposed to you having to write an application to go and get that data and pull it out for yourself on whenever you want. This is more of a business intelligence extract, transform, and load tool, and it will pull all of that data out of the back end for you and put it somewhere you want. The way that works is there's a number of components to it. It uses Azure Data Factory, which is the cloud ETL tool, extract, transform, and load tool. It is a connector that goes back to these elements, things like emails, things like calendar items, contacts, and it will pull those all of those items and put them in one of these storage mechanisms, either Azure Blob Storage, Data Lake, or Data Lake Gen 2. They're stored as JSON files, and then what you do with those JSON files is up to you. You could connect to them directly with Power BI and report on them, for example, or you could take them and transform in many other different ways. So those are a couple of ways to get that inventory. And as a quick demo, let's have a look at Graph Explorer here now for a second. So I'm going to come over here. You can see developer.microsoft.com. You can go in, basically do a quick search on Graph Explorer. One of the nice things about this interface is it lets me log in. Here I am logged in with my UnlimitedViz account. It lets me log in so I'm authenticated. I don't have to worry about messing around with tokens or anything like that, which is what you would normally do when you're developing, if you're experimenting with this stuff. So I could do things like demonstrate this stuff. And there are a number of examples. So if I wanted to see some more samples, I've got down here a OneDrive turned on and the Getting Started guide, but you can see there are samples for all of these different user types. Now, I'm going to use one of the examples right off the bat, say, get me all of the items in my OneDrive. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. This is my OneDrive for Business, obviously. I'm going to select that, and it's just going to run a query. And it's going to take a lot longer than I expected. There we go. And you can see now there's this JSON blob down here of data that's showing me all of the items. So you can see the first item is called archives. Let's come down here a little more. We can see that the next item down here, oh, I missed it. The next item down here is called attachments. And these, if you look down a little bit lower, are folders. You can see that these are folders. So what it's doing is getting me all of the items at the root level of my drive. So I could go and get that data if all I cared about was at the root level of my drive, that'd be fine. But if I wanted to go and get all of the items in my drive, I'm gonna have to iterate through all of the folders and then all of the subfolders and all of the subfolders. The way you do that is just through a series of different calls. You can see what the call to do this is up here. There's a slightly different call. I'm not gonna go hunting around the documentation, but it's all available for you. But the form that takes is this. If I come back up here, I'm going to remove the me from this URL. There we go, the me drive, and I need to specify the item ID. So if I'm looking at attachments, the ID is right above it. It's this hex code. I'm just going to grab that guy, and I'm going to paste this in. Come on, paste this in, John. And I'll make a call to that. I'm going to go ahead and run that query. Now you can see there's different elements in there. We can see at the top there is a file named something.mp4. So there's a video file. The next one I think is, yeah, it's another MP4 file, etc. So that's starting to list out the files in the attachment folder. So if I'm to go and get all of my items from an inventory, I'm going to have to write a recursive application to go and pull that data and put that somewhere else. All right, that's graph. Very quickly, we're getting through this, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end, which is excellent. Finally, the part that we love, of course, is third-party products. If you don't want to do all of this stuff yourself, and in a lot of cases, I would recommend not trying this at home because it's really hard in some cases, depending on what you want to do. If all you want is some basic adoption data and the admin interface is good enough for you, or the analytics app is good enough for you, etc., by all means. You can see how all of that stuff is put together. But there are a number of third-party tools available as well if you want to just drop something in and get going with that kind of data. And these third-party tools tend to rely on one or more of three basic approaches to analyzing data. And the first one is one we have not talked about yet today. The first two are actually, well, actually none of them are. First one is page injection. So this is specific to SharePoint page analytics. So if you wanted to get information about a page, what you would typically do is put some JavaScript essentially on each page one way or another, and then have it fire data back to a repository whenever certain actions happen. And that's how Google Analytics works. That's how Web Trends works. There's a number, by far and away, the largest number of reporting solutions in the market use this particular approach. And it's very strong when it comes to pages. You can get a lot of information about the users and the browsers, et cetera, where they're coming from by using this technique. One of the problems, however, with page injection is it only works on pages. So you couldn't use the page injection technique to do things like tell you when were your OneDrive files synced, when did the user change the sharing permission on a file. Things that fall outside of the realm of a page tend to get lost. And in a lot of cases, depending on how you access it, mobile access won't get logged either. It depends on how that's done. Another approach to this is wiretapping. And wiretapping is kind of an interesting approach. I've only ever seen one company try this approach or use this approach before. And what they do is they clamp essentially a listener on the outside of a company's firewall, and they watch for all of the traffic that's going between that organization and Microsoft. And that way, they're basically catching absolutely everything. It doesn't matter if it was a page, et cetera, et cetera. The problem, of course, with that approach is it has to be going through that company's firewall. So now you're forcing users to go through a VPN, and that's fine for some organizations. But if you want to drop in a VPN just to support your analysis efforts, I don't know that your users are going to be all that happy with you. And then finally, warehousing is another approach to take. So go out and get all of that data from the graph. Go out and get all of that data from the unified audit log and store that and build data models. That's fundamentally what we do. We also do some page injection for SharePoint pages because where the activity, and even with the graph, it doesn't necessarily give you all of the metadata you might want about those artifacts. So yeah, those are a number of different. There's a raft of third-party tools out there. I'd suggest if you're interested in that, go look at all of them before you make any decisions. So with that, let's wrap it up. And I think we're okay for time. Oh, we're very good for time. We got time for a couple questions. The important thing to note here is to get solid information from your Microsoft 365 usage, you first have to know what the question is, right? You have to understand what your need is, and that's going to inform your tool choice. It's going to inform your design choices. As always, there's going to be a trade-off between complexity and flexibility. 100%. It is what it is. That if you want to be able to do anything, it's going to be harder, but it may be rewarding. You need to understand your audience, who's going to be consuming this stuff, and you have to. It's very important. You have to understand retention. How long is that data kept for? If I need to do year-over-year analyses, I can't use any of that out-of-the-box stuff.
So John, Peter here.
Yeah.
Great session, thank you. There is one open question there, and I do want to make another point too, which is I know you've been very respectful about not making this a product pitch, but I think people would actually appreciate maybe a 2-minute overview on what tyGraph is, and without having to do a bunch of heavy lifting yourself, how you can actually get a lot of the benefits of what you talked about. Why don't we start with a question on how to best understand the underlying data model in the Power BI stuff that you were showing earlier in. I recommended you looked at the relationship view in Power BI that does give you sort of a data model view of that, but if you've got better thoughts on that, I'll defer to you there.
Yeah. Well, with Power BI and the relationship view, I don't have a demo prep, so I'd pop one of those up, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just come back to this slide. What is critical if you're going to be retaining this data is you got to make sure you know what's new and what's old, because the volumes of data you're talking about are absolutely massive. We have customers that with billions of rows of data that we're working with, and then you also have to understand how Power BI is put together. And don't store anything you don't need. Make sure you're storing things properly. Column store indexes. You're taking advantage of all the technologies that are available out there, et cetera. And then you want to be able to slice and dice across dimensions and measures. I shouldn't have to worry about, oh, do I use the calendar from this table or that when I'm using this measure, et cetera. You want to make that, from an analyst's standpoint, as easy as possible. And that's kind of why I mentioned before about, that Microsoft Usage Analytics app. It's a great reporting tool. But it's not so great as an analytical tool. And the Power BI, PBIX in particular, is an analytics platform. So you're not necessarily taking the best advantage of Power BI by using it that way, although it certainly fits a specific need. So what tyGraph is, to answer your question, is it's a service, a combination of service, data models, and reports. So our service goes out and collects the data for you. So it connects to your tenant and pulls out all the management data, pulls out graph data. If you're using Yammer, it uses the Yammer endpoints to pull that data. It uses a number of endpoints and warehouses them today. It warehouses them in a SQL Server database. It won't necessarily be the case going forward. But today it's storing them in a SQL database. And then that SQL database feeds a Power BI data model, and that's all optimized to be able to do this sort of analysis. And then we also provide a set of reports that are both useful on their own. There's been a lot of work put into the utility of those reports, but they're extensible. So you can then add on to that data model, for example, and create your own reports off of that. So that does let you slice and dice across all these.
Okay. So just to summarize, tyGraph is a SaaS service that fairly easily attaches to your tenant, harvests all that data, so you don't have to worry about the retention limits that Microsoft has in there, and then provides a rich set of dashboards for you to be able to go much deeper in answering those sorts of questions. Yeah,
we also it is a SaaS service. We also deploy into customers' tenants as well. So if you've got data sensitivity concerns, we could just deploy what's called our harvester. We could deploy the harvester and the database and the data model, everything.
Okay, so you're flexible depending on the customer requirements.
Yep. And what you see on screen, that's just one page of our tyGraph for Teams product showing you interaction between people in a team.
Very cool. I don't see any other questions there, so I think we're almost at the top of the hour anyways. John, I want to thank you very much. This has been a great session. Learned a lot myself, and looking to leverage this, not just internally, but with our own clients, because obviously, understanding how Office 365 is being adopted and used in the organization is a big part of your success factors and change management, and guides your training and approaches forward from there. So excellent topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And with that, we'll bid adieu to everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye now.
Take care, everybody.